You're listening to the Tony Steuer Podcast, where Tony interviews financial literacy advocates who are changing the conversation on money, so you can catch up on the latest trends and ideas in the world of financial literacy and education.
Welcome to the Tony Steuer Podcast. I'm pleased to be joined today by Phuong Luong. Phuong is an educator and financial planner. In this episode, we'll be discussing financial education for a just economy. Phuong, welcome to the Tony Steuer Podcast.
Tony, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to speak with you.
Well, I'm excited to have you on. I think your message is really going to resonate with the listeners. So to get started tell us a little bit about what is your origin story? How did you get started in financial education?
Absolutely. I think for a lot of folks, financial education started with my own education, understanding how to manage my own finances. My family didn't grow up with money, and I really had to learn about the financial system in the United States, about how to open accounts, bank accounts and credit cards, how to read credit reports, all that stuff. Really much through the age of the internet, I was able to Google all that stuff in college, and I started educating myself on that. And I developed a really just big passion for it in my life. I never thought I would do this for a living as a financial planner. But after some twists and turns in other careers I had, I've been a teacher, I've worked in nonprofits. I found financial planning. I'm so glad I did, because that's what I do now for my main work, and I love it.
Well, that's fantastic. Yeah, I don't know how many people I've talked to that say, I grew up and I want to be a financial planner. I want to be an insurance agent. So many of us come to financial services from other things. Yeah, I can imagine a kid walking around saying, hey, I want to be a superhero. Another kid says, I want to be a police officer. Another kid says, hey, I can't wait to be an insurance agent.
One day, we'll get there.
But, that's exciting. So tell us a little bit about, because I think your background as a teacher is so interesting, how has that helped you as a financial planner?
Oh my gosh, it's helped so much. I wouldn't be able to do what I do today without it. And actually, that's why I chose financial planning. I think, we were joking before about, kids don't really grow up thinking they'll do this stuff. I did not either. Actually, even though I had a passion for personal finance, actually, ever since I was a kid, if I really was honest and looked back at it. But I grew up in New York City, and the image in my mind of a financial planner or anyone who worked in finance was Wall Street, right? Like stock traders, the floor, right? The movie Wall Street. It was not a picture of what I envisioned for my future. Because I just that's not me. That doesn't fit my, my life, or my personality. But as I was doing more research, I realized that in financial planning, you work a lot with people. And I really love that. I love educating others. I love working with groups, individuals, and sharing my knowledge, any knowledge that will help the other person reach their goals and the vision for their life that they want. And that's what I loved. And actually, that's why I went to teaching. And I'm able to also do that as a financial planner. And at the same time, as a teacher, you had to really practice, every day, how to put yourself aside and just how to serve the person in front of you, and understand really quickly, what do they want out of this interaction? What do they want out of this lesson? What do they want out of this time that they have given you, have shared with you in your classroom? And as a financial planner now, during their workday, when they're meeting with you, right? You want to make that time with them the most productive use of time possible. And so you have to really listen hard and also be really prepared, and be ready to explain concepts in a way that's going to set them at ease, help them trust your competence, and also get them to where they want to be with all the technical knowledge wrapped into that you need to actually answer their questions. It's really hard stuff. And so being a teacher, it was a boot camp for me to have to do that every day with dozens of students a day in, 4 different classes. I was a math teacher for several years, but also have a master's in special education. So I got so much practice teaching diverse learners and different types of learning modalities, and being able to craft and adjust my messaging, verbal, but also written communication, to the listener and to the learner. And so it was invaluable education. So many advisors and mentors of mine that I know who are in financial planning, they were teachers first, actually. And so I think that's a really interesting connection. And of course, it prepared me to speak and talk to groups. Actually, Tony, I had a terrible stage fright and social anxiety growing up. Just getting in front of a stage. I remember when I was a kid in the spelling bee, I knew how to spell the word, but when it came up to me, I was in front of an entire auditorium, I flubbed it and I just ran off the stage. I was like, I can't do this. And look at me now, I'm speaking with you and I'm in front of groups. And it's because, I realized the secret, and I didn't really learn it until I was a teacher. It's not about you. Get your mind out of your own head and just focus on what the person in front of you needs at this moment. And that flipped the switch for me. So I hope that piece of advice helps other people in the who are listening, who can, are nervous about speaking in front of groups, small or large.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. And you said so many things that are so powerful in there. But I think the underlying thing is what you're talking about is focus on what your client wants. And if you do that, it makes it so much easier, because if you actually listen to people, they'll tell you what they want and help you solve their problems, instead of, coming from, as so many of us do in the industry, not so much financial planners, but other people's, product driven first, rather than, solving a client's challenges first and seeing where they're at. And as you point out, I think the other thing that isn't talked about as much as it needs to be is that people come from different emotional places. They come from different levels of education. Those modalities, as you point out, is so important. I'm getting a lot into behavioral finance. And I think once you understand who people are, that you can help them succeed. So I love it.
Yeah, thanks.
So, there's so many good things that we could talk about, that you talk about. I think one of the things you, and I talked about pre-show that I think would be great to talk about it right now is, how do we start to close the gender and racial wealth gaps? What can we think about it to do that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. It's a really big question. And with all big questions, what I always like to start with, this is the teacher in me, right? We got to define what those are. What are gender and racial wealth gaps? And we can define it in terms of looking at the data. And the data shows it's very clear in terms of the median or average, depending on what metric you want to use, the wealth numbers between Black, white, Asian, Latinx families, Indigenous families. It's a huge range. It's a huge range. And there's differences within racial demographics as well, right? The gaps. But we can see that when we look at the numbers, it's really, really clear that they're based on not just, individual actions, but historical, structural, and systemic actions and events that have taken place throughout our nation's history that has led to these divides, right? And big policy decisions, for example. It's not just individual actions. And so another way to think and, first analyze the gap is that the word gap is actually a really interesting word. I've evolved my understanding in this from the reading I've done, from learning about this. And then we can also add data to the show notes if that's possible, Tony, for people to read more about.
Of course. That'd be great.
The history and the data. But I try not to use the word gap anymore. I talk about gender and racial wealth divides. Because the word divide, the word gap makes you think multiple things, right? It gives you an image of a small space that you can just jump over. Mm-hmm. And it's not that simple because of all the historical, institutional, systemic things that have resulted in this divide. But also when we think about the gap, this brings back to my teaching experience, right? Because the word gap was used a lot for the achievement gap, right? The difference with different students, typically in Black and white students, on how they scored on standardized tests like the SAT or different statewide exams when you're in elementary school or high school. And we've seen often that students of color and students who are coming from lower income backgrounds tend to score a lot lower than students who are coming from white families and students who are live in higher income areas. And so there's a gap there. But I don't, it focuses on the belief that the students that are scoring at the top level, that's the standard, that's where everyone should be scoring. But what I believe is that, when you're thinking about this in terms of wealth, but also achievement when you're looking at test scores, is that I think that the potential for everybody is lowered when there's this much inequality in terms of achievement versus in test scores or in wealth. And to drive this home, I guess what I'm saying is that I think the wealth divide numbers and the wealth gap numbers, it focuses too much on individual household wealth. We're not thinking and looking enough at community wealth. How much wealth is in the community? How much wealth is in just even the geography where people are living, right? Are there parks and public spaces that are beautiful and clean and accessible? Is there really good public transportation and access to bike lanes and walking paths where people can actually get around, and reliable public transportation? People can actually get to work. People can get to work on time. People can get to school on time. Is there adequate funding for public schools, right? Unfortunately, a lot of public schools in this country are based, the funding is based on local property taxes, right? And so when we think about redlining and all that, we can see already there's a through line between the historical impacts on wealth divides and what types of services are available in a community where someone lives because of that history of segregation we have in our country. And so, there's a lot in that term, gender and racial wealth gaps. But I think, by talking about, and I'm still learning, I've been reading this stuff really started during my time as a teacher. I wish I learned it earlier. I wish it was taught to me in schools. I wish it was taught to me in my master's program for teaching, but I really had to learn on my own and also from my peers and friends who, and I credit researchers, but also academics, but also writers who come from disadvantaged populations who are speaking their story and doing the research and publishing it and sharing it and making it accessible to people like me and folks like us to actually apply it to our work. And so, I think it's important to talk about what these things are, because then when we truly understand what are we dealing with, then we can think of all the possible and potential solutions. And so we've covered a wide range, but it can be a lot of things. When people ask me, what can I do to support this? You can talk about it, you can educate others about it, right? Which where a lot of people land, right? They write about it, they talk about it. In terms of actually making a difference on the policy level, that could be a little harder, but that's possible too. What can financial advisors do? There's different things. One is, working on a pro bono basis with folks that have been impacted on the end of, falling on the divide, where they've lived with disinvestment in their communities their whole lives, or maybe their family doesn't have wealth and they're building it for the first time. I have advisor friends who are focusing on that, families that are building wealth for the first time. Something that I do now is I help clients. I have a handful of clients that I manage wealth for, and we are very, very values aligned. And I work with them because they ask me, Phuong, can you help me? Sometimes they might not ask about this. Like, they might not say exactly, how can you help me close gender and racial wealth divides, right? That language is very academic, and they're not asking me that, but they say, I want to do more to support racial justice. Like, how can I do that? And many times they have ideas of their own. So I'm helping them redistribute and transfer assets, right? They're moving money, they're giving money away to organizations that are being led by folks who want to create a more just economy, right? They want to create a more just political system, and they identify organizations, and as an advisor, I help them move it. And I do it in a tax efficient way, and I do it in a way that's actually supporting their goals for the long term, not just for their giving, but also for their financial planning, for their retirement and things like that. Or I help them figure out where their investments can go to help meet that goal. So there's so many different ways to go into this, but I think the number one way my understanding has evolved is, instead of just focusing on households, focusing on what is community wealth and how can we support that?
Yeah, that's so powerful. You hit on so many good points in there. I'd love to go line by line with you through it. But in thinking about things that I've heard and come across, there are some very structural things that, like the pink tax, just the cost of being a woman is what, 10 to 15%, I think, on products. That are easily defined. But I think the point you make about property taxes is especially intriguing because you can see it reflected in the enrichment programs that schools are able to offer, because the schools in the wealthier areas have PTAs that are able to raise more money, and parents who are more engaged because their jobs allow them to have some flexibility in the hours that they can be at school. And it is self-sustaining, that difference in the communities. And the other thing is, like you pointed out, is the structure on like credit scores. I saw this great video about the racial bias in credit scores. And it's some of these things, like you point out, is we don't think about it because we're stuck, and not stuck necessarily, but we're in our own track in life and who we know. And this really hit home as I was talking to a friend of mine who's a young Black financial planner. And he brought up a very good point, about this. He goes, look, what does a 65-year-old white male know about talking to a single Black mom in her 20s? What do they have in common? And, for me, that really summed it up is, there's that, it's a whole different experience in life that these two people are having. And so bridging that gap is, as you pointed out, is you have to go beyond it and think about how it is for other people. And it gets back to what you said earlier, is to focus on somebody else's life experiences and not your own life experiences when you're dealing with clients. And, to bring it back to financial planning, and what I've found is, how do people deal with money? What is their viewpoint of their own financial products based on, their family and everything else? We were having a little bit of a discussion this morning on LinkedIn about allowances and, whether they're valid or not. And but it's kind of that whole thing. And, just one other thing that you point out, and I think too, is, focus on that community health. Is the word health is so key, is that it goes beyond a client's finances, but how they're thinking and how they're interacting with all these steps. So I love what you're talking about. So one of the things I want to make sure we hit upon is, and you started to talk about this, how do we go about creating a more just economy for all?
Yeah, huge question. And I'm still learning myself. And what's been really interesting for me for the last couple of years, I've been learning more about how to do this in a way that allows someone's financial plan to continue meeting their goals. But how do you do this, and on the investing side? How do you do this on the giving side? I mentioned some of those examples. And I realized what's out of our hands as financial planners or financial coaches. And I mean, there's policies to look at, there's housing policy, there's policies around what types of businesses can be started and what's in the way for certain businesses to be started. So one thing I've been looking at are structures and ways for communities to own land. So there's something called community land trusts. And where I live, right, there's an example of a project, and I don't want to get the name wrong, and I can add it to the show notes, right, so people can look into it, on a community that got together and they purchased land to keep it in perpetuity for affordable housing, so that people in the community can own their homes and be sure that the value, that they would still get some equity from the home, but also that it would stay affordable for future generations. All right, so I think that's a beautiful thing. So things like that. How do we make affordable housing a lot easier? And also, how do we create community ownership for that from housing, because it goes back to the idea that I think we focus so much on individual wealth, but when we think about wealthy people and what it means to have wealth, right? You also, like, you could have an individual wealth, but if your family and your community is not wealthy, and I don't just mean from a sense of financial stuff, like you said, Tony, it's about health, but it's also about environmental wealth, the parks, the clean air, clean water, not having a ton of pollution when you walk outside your door, right? That's all a part of your community balance sheet. And wealthy people live in wealthy communities. Okay. And so it just sucks. It's a whole cycle of wealth that flows around when that happens. And so how do we create more wealth that's shared, that's equitable, things like that? Community land trusts are interesting. Another type of business structure that I've been looking at are worker-owned cooperatives. Worker-owned cooperative is that instead of, different shareholders owning the wealth at the top, right, or certain owners of the firm, that there are multiple owners, that everyone, maybe not everyone, but because you have to work at the organization for a period of time before you can become an owner, but there's shared ownership amongst the employees. But actually their name is not employees, they're worker owners. So that's a different structure. And there are ways to support them through investing in different groups called community development financial institutions or community development. Yeah, CDFIs. So CDFIs are really great. I can share an article that I actually wrote for Morningstar. I'm a contributing writer to Morningstar. And I wrote an article on how to invest in CDFIs for impact. And it's a way to do impact investing that, I think a lot of more people should know about. I'm not saying it's right for everybody. It does take a little more effort to understand what you're doing. Never invest in something if you don't understand what it is. All right. And this is not investment advice, but I think it's important to just learn more what it is because I also think the more we know about this, the more it's not just for investing purposes, but if you ever want a loan, right, consider a CDFI, consider an organization whose mission is to help the community, right? So the whole article that I wrote shares the history of CDFIs and also what they are and how to get involved either in investing or just understanding what they are and maybe working for one, right? And so, yeah, I think all of that is how I've seen my work intersect with the just economy, but there's so many ways to go into it.
Yeah, no, I love that. And like all of your answers, there's so much to impact and that we could discuss. But, I think it's, one thing you said that is understanding something before you do it, I think is just such valuable advice across the financial spectrum. Well, it's great life advice, across the board. Even if you're going to go bungee jumping,
understand which direction you're going in. and what's there when you jump. Look down first.
Yeah. And the other thing is when you talk about the community wealth and community housing, I think the other thing too is that we don't talk about as much is culturally that people based upon their culture have a different way of looking at, let's say, aging and caregiving, and how they're going to take care of that. Based on their culture, do the grandparents live at home or do they live in their own house? And all these things make a difference towards somebody's financial health because, if we're going with a traditional, pathway towards wealth that's not going to work for people in certain communities because that's just not how they, their goals and their vision for their future. So that'd be great if you could share this article. So, I have a closing question, but before we get to that, I was just wondering if you could define impact investing and what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So impact investing can mean, when we talk about sustainable investing, impact investing, ESG, SRI, there are a lot of different names for this stuff. And I also wrote an article about this. I'll share it in the show notes with you, Tony, so you can share it with the listeners. It can be really tricky to find because even the industry doesn't totally have a defined definition for this. But when we think about impact investing, what people could mean when they talk about it is investing with your values. That's really what it's about. And it could be investing in public markets, right? Stocks, bonds, impact. But mostly when people talk about impact investing, they're talking about investing in private investments, things like the CDFIs I was talking about, things that are not, listed on Wall Street, where you can just buy, click like a stock, like things like that. But investing for impact in private things, right? Maybe early stage companies, VC investing, venture capital investing, a lot of different ways. So if I was speaking to an advisor, I might call it like an alternative investment in a high growth area. Right. That's kind of jargon for you there. You like that?
Yeah.
Or if I was talking to an organizer, an activist, or maybe one of my clients, I might use language like, it's investing with your values and to make a difference in an area that you want to make a difference in, right? Whether it be community wealth, racial justice, Black and brown led leaders, things like that.
Well, that's great. And I think you said something super important there that I think gets glossed over is if you're speaking to financial planners, you're going to call it alternative investments. But to most people, even in the professional financial services community, nobody knows what alternative investments is. And it's really the definition that I think is important as a planner, as an advisor, no matter where you are, is that you take that into account is what are people trying to accomplish, help them meet their goals, and they're going to respect you as an advisor, and they're going to be happy with your services instead of just throwing more jargon at them, saying, oh, you need 5% of your assets in alternative investments. And then they go home and talk to their partner and say, hey, my advisor said I need to put some money in alternative investments. And the partner says, great, let's buy some NFTs. That sounds pretty alternative to me.
Right. It's such a broad category. Yeah. Impact investing can be a part of alternative investing. Like real estate is alternative investing, for example, right? That's one example. But NFTs can also be, depending on if you think it's even an investment, right? So depending on who you talk to. Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the issues that the financial services community has is that we use those terms, we don't fully define them for people, and then people go out and, when they talk to their partners or they talk to their friends, go, hey, I'm working with a CFP, and she said to get into alternative investments, and then, it's that whole game of telephone is, the third person who hears the advice is going, yeah, NFTs are great, CFP's endorsing NFTs. Right. And it's like, CFP is all what, like, I never said that, it's alternative investments, in my mind include, real estate impact investing. And I think that's something we need to be conscious of when we're talking to our clients, is that our clients are going to talk to other people and they're not going to remember everything that we said and how we defined it. Yeah. And that's a challenge. So, as we wrap up, Phuong, what is your number one tip on financial wellness?
My number one tip that I tell everybody, no matter the level of wealth, is, I used to say get organized, but I think when people hear that, they can feel maybe a little stressed with that because like, oh, there's so much to organize. So what I say now is just something a little more directed. I say, list out all the different accounts that you own that, are, it could be savings accounts, it could be investment accounts, and also list out all the debt that you have under your name and just make a list, right? And depending on their level, their appetite for understanding the jargon, I usually tell them, we call this a balance sheet, right? Like any corporation is going to have a balance sheet of all their assets and debts. Think of it as you are a corporation, the Tony Corporation, right? What does your balance sheet look like? And just get it all down. And depending on how someone reacts to that, right, advice, I learn a lot, right? If they say, oh, I don't know if I can do that. Okay, that tells me where we're starting from. They could have a lot of financial anxiety. They could have a lot of financial trauma that they're experiencing from that, right? Maybe they've had wealth before and they lost it, or their family had wealth and lost it, or maybe their family never had wealth and they don't know what they're doing and they don't know how to start. And that tells me a lot when I suggest that thing first. And so I say it softly, I say it slowly, and I watch, and I try to watch what is their reaction when I say this. And if they go, oh, I've already done it. right? It's like, okay. So that also gives me information. But I think that's a really important place just to see where you stand. And as an advisor, but that's just my advice, because as an advisor, I can actually help them get to the next place from that. If someone was working on their own, I still think it's an important thing to do. And that's typically my first tip, because anything you do after that, it's most likely going to be based on that list, right? When you look at that, do you are you happy with what you see? Are you satisfied? If you are, awesome, you're doing great. Keep going. Keep doing what you're doing. If you want to make some changes, this list is gonna reflect what those changes can be, and then you can actually name it, right? You can actually attach some numbers to it. Do you want to increase the balance? Do you want to decrease the balance on this? Do you want to consolidate these accounts? Sometimes that's the majority of the work, just getting it down on paper, especially for clients with a really complex debt, right? Maybe they have collections, maybe they have judgments, they might have multiple student loans to their name, and they don't know where all the servicers are. It can be a lot of work to get this list done. And so, but that's an important starting place for, I think, all clients who are working with an advisor or doing it on their own.
Yeah, no, I've called it a cash flow statement. I try to avoid the word budget. But yeah, it's inventorying what somebody has. And like you said, is that allows you to so much, input to how the client processes. Are they detail oriented? Are they a big picture person? Are they lost? Are they intimidated? And so I love it. That's a great way to do it. And you're getting valuable information that helps you with the financial planning process from the client, getting their buy-in and doing it. So that's awesome advice. So where can people learn more about you and keep up with what Phuong's up to?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. So I'm pretty quiet on social media, but I try to write regularly. Sometimes, the practice and my other work gets in the way, but I try to. I'm trying to write more. I write for Morningstar. I try to publish once a month or once every other month. And so they can find me on there, and I'll put a link to some of my articles that might be relevant for the listeners, Tony, for today's conversation. And that's I would say that's the number one place. And can I give a book recommendation?
Of course.
Okay. So actually there's two. One that I've shared before, and that I've written about a lot before, is The Color of Money by Dr. Mirza Baradharan. Love that book to talk about the history. Yeah. Okay. The history of just financial history, why we are where we are in terms of the racial wealth divides and gender wealth divides. But also since then, I read another book by Heather McGhee, who is the former executive director of Demos. I believe she stepped down, but I'm not sure, but she was there, and just an incredible leader and author. And the book is The Sum of Us, SUM, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Because what I don't do a great job of, but I'm trying to, as I talk more about these topics and issues that I care about, is that racism, financial history, the racial wealth divide and gender wealth divide, it impacts all of us, not just the families that are living in poverty or living in financial insecurity. It affects all of us. And I learned so much from that from the author here, Heather McGhee, on how it impacts everybody. And she shares a lot of case studies throughout history, but also present day, on how it impacts. And and I think coming back to that community wealth, because when you talk about community wealth, it's not just about individuals and families living in that community. Or individuals who are on the lower end of the wealth spectrum, but also everybody who lives in that area, right? If there's not clean, safe parks, if there's not adequate hospital care, if schools are not well funded, it's impacting the entire area, whether or not you yourself as a family have wealth or not enough of it or have enough, right? If your neighbor doesn't have enough, if your community doesn't have adequate services, we're all suffering. And this comes into the environment, into the institutions that we need to live our lives. And it shows, it really shows in terms of like where we are today, Tony. And this book really just puts it all together. So I've learned so much from it. And I'm still continuing to learn. So thanks, Tony, for this great conversation. I hope that's a book recommendation that you'll want to check out. And I'd love to talk to you about it if you get to read it, and that your listeners will like as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. I really appreciate it. And, one of the things I was thinking about that we didn't talk about, and we're wrapping up, but, the pay gap between the lowest paid worker and the CEO, and people underestimate what kind of long-term tail impact it has if their employees are actually not able to go out and buy the company's goods and services. And that's like what you talk about, is it's very short-sighted for the CEO to make 10,000 times what the line worker makes. And I think that's part of it. So I love that you're doing this work, and I really appreciate everything that you've shared here today. Phuong, thanks again for joining us on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you. This was a great conversation. Thanks, Tony.
Definitely. And to all our listeners and viewers, I'll be posting links on the website to all these resources that Phuong mentioned, as well as to her column at Morningstar, so you can check it out. And until next time, thanks for joining us.